All right, let's jump into this. We have Mike, Mike and myself, Dawn, are here tonight. Danny Robin couldn't join us, but she's the board chair from DarkSky Colorado that we've been working on with this program as well. So let's real quick talk a little bit about DarkSky Colorado.
Don, can
And
I pause you for a minute?
sure.
Um, we're not seeing the full slides,
Oh,
just
sorry, I didn't put that into just presentation mode. Thank you.
there we go.
There we go. All right, so DarkSky Colorado is a entity of DarkSky International. So for those of you that have been interested in dark skies, night photography, you're probably familiar with DarkSky International. They're the organization that does the, excuse me, the certifications of dark sky locations around the world. So DarkSky Colorado is the Colorado chapter of that organization, of which Mike is one of their board members. And their mission is to restore and protect the nighttime environment and protect communities and wildlife from the harmful effects of light pollution through outreach, advocacy, and conservation. So they do quite a bit of work. Let me reduce this. So real quickly, why are we here today? So ultimately, June is Dark Sky Month in Colorado. So June 1st through June 30th, we celebrate, the beauty of the dark skies in Colorado. We're pretty lucky here in Colorado to have a lot of places where you can see the Milky Way and see dark skies. So basically, we want to recognize the importance of dark skies. We want to note where you can go in Colorado to enjoy dark skies. And then we also do want to recognize that Governor Jared Polis, since 2019, has proclaimed June as Dark Sky Month. So that gives us an opportunity to really focus on the benefits of protecting the night sky, why it's important to reduce light pollution, the impacts of light pollution. And we'll talk about a lot of this stuff today. And then we'll get into the fun stuff about photography, whether we are, we'll talk about tips for photography, and then we'll talk about some of the fun things that happen when you're out in the darkness of night. So what are dark skies? The Dark Sky Movement is a worldwide campaign to reduce light pollution. We do have a pretty significant increase in light pollution around the world. So we'll talk about some of those statistics in a minute. But there is limited light pollution. That's the goal. We want to enhance stargazing. We want to protect nocturnal ecosystems and preserve cultural heritage. This is a map. I find this map absolutely unbelievable. If you look at this, you can see where all the lights are. This is actually an image taken by NASA. But it shows you can see where all the different cities are. But it's actually kind of creeping, at least here in the US, it's creeping west as the population moves farther and farther west. This is a closer view of what the US looks like. And you can just see, New York City, New Jersey. This is where I grew up over here in the Northeast. I did not grow up seeing the Milky Way. Pretty much the only thing I could see at night was the Big Dipper. And that was about it. So my first experience, I came out to Utah in 2000 and took a camping trip and got up in the middle of the night, and my jaw just dropped. It was just unbelievable how many stars. I had no idea there were just that many stars out there. So the definition of light pollution is that it is the human-made alteration of outdoor light levels from those occurring naturally. So there is some natural light that occurs at night. Moonlight's a really good example of that. But basically, light pollution is everything that is human created. Any of those lights, car lights, headlights, flashlights, landscaping lights, all of that is human developed. So we have different components of light pollution. We won't go into a lot of this real depth, but I wanted to cover, there's glare, there's sky glow. A lot of times you'll see that in photos. There's light trespass, which is the light falling where it is not intended or needed. So that's kind of that creeping light that kind of spreads out. And then clutter, which is the bright, confusing, excessive groupings of light sources. So here are some different photos that show you some of these different examples. And a lot of these lights, real simple things, just kind of capping some of this light pollution can really help. And on evenings, and for those of you that are photographers, you may actually have observed this, is that if it's cloudy or if there is snow on the grounds, if there's snow on the ground like this photo the second in from the left, that actually creates a lot of reflective light. So it actually gets worse in those conditions when you have a lot of clouds and a lot of snow on the ground. So 80% of North Americans can no longer see the Milky Way because of the effects of artificial light at night. Overall, the Milky Way is no longer visible to more than 1/3 of the world's population. I find these numbers absolutely astounding when you think of how beautiful the night sky is. It's, people just don't they either don't go out at night and they don't realize what they're missing, or they've grown up like that, kind of similar to the way I grew up in New Jersey outside of Philadelphia, and just not necessarily even realizing that we had more to see out there. So why do dark skies matter? So they matter for night sky heritage, ecological integrity, energy conservation and climate, human health and public safety, and astronomy. Just an enjoyment of astronomy. So there's a night sky heritage. There is a lot of, historically, there is a lot tied up into that. There was mythology around a lot of it. Artists were very heavy into night skies. This Van Gogh painting is a real popular painting that a lot of people are going to be familiar with, but things that people could see. I mean, there was a time before light pollution that there was nothing to stop that. The only thing that would stop seeing the night sky or the abundance of what's up there in space would have been the moon. This is one that's really important to me in particular. This is ecological integrity. The rhythm of day and night has been radically altered, affecting reproduction, nourishment, sleep, and protection. And some of those examples include sea turtles, birds, and fireflies. Birds, you may or may not know that most birds migrate at night, and the more light pollution that is out there, that can actually throw them off course. We see a lot of building strikes with birds because they're flying towards the light of different cities and then they hit buildings. And the sea turtles are probably the poster child for light pollution at night. When a sea turtle hatches, they actually follow their instinct is to go towards the light. As they look towards the horizon, that in their mind is where the water is. So they hatch on the beach and they know to follow the light because in their instincts, that's where the water is and that's where they need to go. But as the light pollution increases in places where they live, in Florida, South Carolina, different towns along the coast, they're actually going in towards, this is a really good example of this, they're actually going inland to try to find light because that's what they're attracted to. This little baby sea turtle here is attracted into this light here. So that's actually causing them to do things like, go out into roads and go into neighborhoods and, places where there might be predators. So the sea turtle population has actually been impacted by light pollution. The other issue is evolving to migrate at night is beneficial to the survival of birds in many ways. You have nocturnal migrants use the stars and moon for navigation. Nocturnal migrants can more easily avoid predators. Nocturnal migrants are less likely to overheat because it's a lot cooler at night without the sun. And nocturnal migrants take advantage of calmer air. So you can see these migration maps. You can see where a lot of birds come in from South America and go up to North America on these travels. And as they're traveling, all that light, as I mentioned earlier, the light strikes on buildings. That's why there's campaigns, called Lights Out. Different cities across the U.S. follow Lights Out campaigns, and that's supposed to help the birds to get back into the darkness of night. The other thing with a lot of animals is that there are a lot of prey and predators that rely on night to hunt or to stay safe. There are a lot of animals like those animals that live in the desert. It's hot during the day. They use the cover of night where it's a lot cooler. So as there's more light pollution that kind of disturbs them and changes their patterns. Insects are sensitive to changes in light intensity, wavelength sources, and other factors. It creates habitat loss. Fireflies are another poster child for that situation. Firefly numbers are actually declining pretty rapidly as well. Energy conservation and climate, of course, the more we turn the lights off, the more energy we save. Dark Sky estimates that at least 30% of outdoor light is wasted in the United States because of improper shielding or poorly aimed lighting. And that's at a cost of almost $3.3 billion annually and the release of 21 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. So again, some really astounding statistics around just turning lights off, the simplicity of that. I know In Colorado, I know of several locations, and not to pinpoint any particular business out, but I know of several locations where, I mean, the light, it looks like daylight if you walk through their parking lots at night, and it's just unbelievable how much they're not recognizing that. Human health can actually be affected by improper lighting, and part of it is that our own rhythms need that night, the darkness of night. We're supposed to sleep then, and exposure to artificial light has been proven to increase obesity, cause depression, or make depression even worse. It can create sleep disorders. It can cause diabetes, and it has been linked to breast cancer as well. So we need that sleep-wake pattern that is governed by the natural day-night cycle. Public safety, this is a big one. A lot of people think that, I always find these photos fascinating. A lot of people think that public safety is actually better when there's a lot of light. But when you look at this top photograph where you have this really glary light, and there's somebody actually standing in this gate of this fence, and you can't see them. But as soon as you shield that light with your hand, all of a sudden you can see that person again. And I'm sure you've experienced this. If for those of us that go out at night, a lot of times we have headlamps on, and if you blind that headlamp into somebody else's face, or if they do it to you, all of a sudden you can't see past that light. So it's the same thing with safety and security, is that actually having lower, reducing the brightness of that light can actually improve safety. And of course, astronomy. There's just an amazing abundance of stars and nebulas and all kinds of different things out in space. And the more light pollution we have, the less we can see that. So in the past, dates, Babylonian, Greek, Egyptian, Chinese, Mayan, and indigenous cultures really looked up into space to see a lot of that. And today, we're kind of losing that connection between us and the stars. So what is DarkSky Colorado doing to help? That organization is basically working on advocacy, outreach, and conservation. Advocacy, just like Governor Jared Polis proclaiming June as Dark Sky Month to raise awareness about it, that's part of the advocacy that the organization is doing throughout Colorado, and others are doing within the state. With outreach, raising awareness about light pollution impacts and solutions through design, planning, communications, and distribution. I mentioned lights out prior. So in the spring and the fall, during the bird migration seasons, you'll see these campaigns of Lights Out Colorado, or Lights Out whatever city or state you may be in. Excuse me. These are programs that actually remind people, turn those lights out at night. At 10 o'clock at night, try to get those lights off so that you can actually encourage the birds to migrate the way that they're supposed to be. Conservation, you want to promote the participation in communities, parks, and places in the Colorado Dark Sky Certification Mentor Program. This is something that I've actually been involved with in Estes Park. They're actually looking at becoming a dark sky community. Within Colorado, there are 15 places that have been certified as international dark sky places. I believe it's 11, I think it's 11. It's 5 that have dark sky communities. I believe it's 10 that are the dark sky parks. So you have parks like Black Canyon and the Gunnison. You have Great Sand Dunes National Park. There's a state park in northeast Colorado. You have Dinosaur National Monument. Those are the parks. And then you have the communities that are places like Westcliff and Silvercliff or Creststone, where the community itself has actually come together to say, you know what, we want to reduce the light pollution that's happening in our community and actually be able to see the sky, even if you're standing in town. So what can you do to help? There's 5 principles for responsible outdoor lighting. So we can all do this even out on our own homes. Use light only if it is needed. So that goes back to turning off lights. It'll save you money. So it helps you in your own pocketbook, and then it helps reduce the light pollution. Use direct light so it falls only where it is needed to prevent that unnecessary spread of light. Use light, the light should be no brighter than what is necessary. Use light only when it is needed, and use a warmer color lights when possible versus the bright. And I know that's kind of a catch-22, right? The LEDs are bright. The older ones, not so much anymore, but the older LED lights are a bright white. They do save energy, but they also produce more light, they emit more light. So if you can find LED lights that actually are a little bit warmer color, that can actually help reduce the light pollution too. So if you're interested in becoming more involved with DarkSky Colorado, you can take a look at their website. They're always looking for people to kind of help out. Like I said, I've gotten involved in helping in the process up in Estes Park for getting them designated as a dark sky community. It will take several years. There's a lot of data that has to be collected to have that happen, but it is a pretty interesting process. We went out one night already to actually measure dark skies with some meters, and that was an interesting activity to see what those levels come up to. So I was impressed with that. So I'm going to, our next phase of this presentation is to talk about tips for photographing the night sky. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about me, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mike. So I've already mentioned I am a native of New Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia. So I grew up in South Jersey, which is even a little bit better night skies wise than North Jersey, but we still didn't see too much. I did move to Colorado in 2002. I've studied photography, communications, marketing, but after spending 20 years in corporate marketing, I decided to go after my passions and follow my dreams. And I've been doing this since 2013. I wrote a book about 100 things to do in Estes Park. That's a fun book about different things that you might not know about. And then I was past president of the North American Nature Photography Association as well. So this is my contact information. If you want to take a quick screenshot of that, we can show this again at the end if anybody does not catch that. And I am going to turn it over to Mike now.
Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm Mike Pach, and I also want to make sure everybody knows to stick around till the end of the presentation, because both Dawn and I have some special offers to present to you. I am a native of the south side of Chicago. I moved to Colorado in 1996 from St. Louis. I have actually have a degree in aerospace engineering, so I call myself a recovering engineer because I'm using my brain differently these days. My interest in photography began in high school with my very first trip to Colorado. I came out on a 5-day backpacking trip and was just blown away with the beauty of the mountains. I had borrowed my brother's camera. I didn't have one of my own at the time, and that's where I first fell in love with photography as well. So I do specialize in the night sky photography, and I also do event photography. I teach classes and workshops, and a few years ago, I published the book for the Colorado Springs 150th anniversary called Colorado Springs Then and Now. And I am the most recent member of the DarkSky Colorado board, and I've been an advisory board member for Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation, which is an organization for land managers, nonprofit organizations, and businesses that are involved in some way in outdoor recreation, and I am there to be the voice for the photography community. I'm also an ambassador for Move, Shoot, Move, and I learned a new term recently called nyctophilia. And nyctophilia means that you find peace and calmness in the dark. So that describes me. I feel very peaceful and calm, and I enjoy being out in the dark. So you can definitely call me a nyctophile. And this is all about me, my website, my email address, Facebook, YouTube. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I've got some tutorials on using the Move, Shoot, Move trackers and some other things. Instagram, I do have galleries, multiple galleries on SmugMug. And I also run a retail business where I sell filters and tripods and inkjet papers, and that site is adventurecamphoto.com.
Mike,
Okay.
do you want me to go through this real quick?
Sure.
So for night photos, so I have other camera equipment that I use for other types of photography, but for night photography, I use my two different Nikon bodies. I have a D850. Whoops. I have a D850 and a Nikon Z7. The Z7 is the mirrorless, my newer camera body, but I still love the sensor and the colors that I get out of the D850. So I'll keep using it as long as I can. I use a Nikon 14 to 24 millimeter, which is an f2.8 lens, and a Nikon 24 to 70. This photo on the right is the 14 to 24. I have a tripod, which is a necessity when you're out photographing. It's a robust carbon fiber with a unique ball head. You have also, an L bracket's really helpful. I have a really right stuff for both of them. I have one for each body because they are body specific. A remote shutter is another necessity. My preference is to actually have a wired remote. I don't want to deal with batteries in the dark. Other people feel differently. This is just my preference, but I like to keep it simple. And so there's no batteries in it. It's just a wired. I think it's probably about a 4-foot wire on that or so. The only challenge I do have on occasion is if it's really cold out, I do have to be careful. It can actually crack and if it gets real fragile. Headlamp's a necessity. So I have a Petzl Actic core. You want to make sure that it has red lights and different modes if you need brighter or so that particular headlamp has 3 different modes. It has a brightness, but at night you really want to try to use red light so that you don't ruin your night vision. And then star trackers. And I'm not going to talk too much about this because this is Mike's really good with star trackers, and he has a couple of different ones. So I will pass this back over to Mike.
Okay. So my current camera of choice is the Canon R6. I love that camera and I love the mirrorless bodies. I, at this point, wish I could buy another one. I don't even want to use my DSLRs anymore. So, but I also have used Canon 5D Mark IV and the Canon 6D, and I still have all those camera bodies. I'm considering having my 6Ds converted for astrophotography. My lens of choice for astro is the Tamron 15 to 30 G2 f2.8. I also use my RF 24 to 105, and I started out using, or one of the lenses I started out using was the 17 to 40L, and even though it's a f4 lens, I did have pretty good luck with that one. Tripods, I use the Explorer EXP Pro and also Really Right Stuff Versa. The EXP Pro is a bit smaller, and so it's easier for me to carry if I have to go on a hike. The Really Right Stuff is really expensive, but it's also a very good tripod, and I normally use that if I am not walking anywhere, but I've grown to really like my Explorer a lot. I have the Canon remote, and like Dawn, I prefer to have fewer things with batteries. The more things that can go wrong, or trying to avoid things that can go wrong is a good idea. So if you have a wired remote, then that's one less thing for you to worry about. And I've also have discovered that through my experience in buying brand name remotes and third-party remotes, I've had quite a few third-party remotes fail, and they're very inexpensive and not made very well. And so I'd rather spend the extra money to get something that's going to work well under severe conditions. I also like the Really Right Stuff L brackets. I prefer an L bracket that's made specifically for your camera body so it won't slip. And then I currently have 3 trackers: the new Move Shoot Move Nomad, the Move Shoot Move Rotator, which is the original version, which has recently been discontinued. And I also have the Skywatcher Star Adventurer 2i. Okay, who's going to talk about this?
Go for it, Mike.
Okay. All right. So recommended gear for photographing the night sky. You want a good camera body with a high ISO range. So I am typically shooting at ISO 6400. But if that's your top ISO, then you're going to have a problem with a lot of noise. And full frame versus crop frame, which is better? Well, crop frame cameras are usually less expensive, but full frame sensors will create less noise, and that just has to do with the physics of sensors. So I shoot on full frame. When I switched from crop frame to full frame, it was a game changer for me, and I really enjoy using the full frame cameras. And then the other question is DSLR versus mirrorless. So there's a lot of great features to the mirrorless cameras that I really like. And some of those features work very, very well for night photography. So including focusing in the dark. So at this point, I'm leaning more towards mirrorless cameras as my choice. Lenses, usually wider is better for the Milky Way. It's a big sky and the Milky Way is enormous. So getting a lot of that into your photos can be desirable. Just a few lenses there. 14 to 24 is a common lens, a very popular and good lens that Nikon has. I have the Tamron 15 to 30, as I mentioned earlier. Canon has a 16 to 35. I think Sony has a 16 to 35 too, but something in that range, 14 to 16 for full frame body, and 11 to 16 or 10 to 22 for a crop frame camera. And then faster is better, although I should have put an asterisk there next to that. So some of the lenses that open up to 1.4, 1.8 are not sharp, that wide open. So a lot of times it's better that you don't shoot at the edge of your optics, meaning that you are completely wide open. So stopping your aperture down by 1/3 of a stop or 2/3 of a stop can really help eliminate a common problem, which is called coma. And that's a stretching of the stars at the edges or the corners of your images. It's very, very important to have a sturdy tripod. It's one of the biggest issues that I have with my students on my workshops is that they come out with $20, $30 tripods that they bought at a box store, and those tripods just are not sturdy enough to withstand doing very long exposures, and especially if you're doing something that's extremely long, like in minutes. So making sure that you have a good sturdy tripod is critical. Also, as Dawn mentioned, having a remote is essential. You want to be able to be hands off with your camera when you're taking photos. And then also, many of you have probably heard of an intervalometer. An intervalometer is also a remote type of device that allows you to program a series of photos and length and interval and things like that. Some cameras have intervalometers built in, but other cameras you have to buy the intervalometer separately. And some people will tell you that you need an intervalometer for this kind of work. No, you need a remote. So a remote is a very simple device with just a shutter button and a lock on it. So you can do quite a bit with your remote. I do have an intervalometer and my new camera has one, but I always forget how to use it. So I'm not really using the intervalometer that much. And then the L brackets. The L brackets are a game changer, especially if you are wanting to do vertical shots and especially make panoramas. So when you make a panorama with a ultra wide angle lens, it's better to shoot vertical frames to make a horizontal panorama. And using an L bracket allows you to rotate your camera around the camera body instead of trying to flip your tripod head over into that little slot and then you're rotating around an arm. So I highly recommend getting L brackets for your cameras.
Remember, we do all this in the dark, so
Yeah.
anything that makes it easier is always better.
All right, Dawn, you can talk about this one. I need to take a drink.
Okay, gotcha. Gotcha. So some of the other gear, I would say night photography, maybe more so than some other things, really requires some additional gear. We've already talked about the headlamp or a flashlight. I do not really recommend using a flashlight. My preference is to have a headlamp for a couple of different reasons. One's it's hands off. It's, you know, it's on your head. I always think back to that movie Weird Science when I think it was Weird, was it Weird Science? It was one of the John Hughes movies where the kids, maybe it was 16 Candles, that's what it was, with Molly Ringwald, where the kids had, there were like three of them with headlamps on, and it was, you know, they were positioned as kind of the geeky kids, and I'm like, yeah, look, that's me now. Now I have a headlamp. I have one in every bag. That's something else I will mention. I do keep a headlamp not only in my car, but I have one in every one of my camera bags. Because it's really something that if you don't have it, it's really not safe to walk around at night without it, especially in a place like Colorado where we're going to be out in rocks and trails and snow. So that way I know I always do have it, and remember the batteries or make sure it's charged. Warm
Plus,
clothing.
Dawn, plus flashlights don't taste very good. So
Right.
when you need to use both your hands, the flashlight goes in your mouth and
Yeah, it's not, your dentist isn't gonna like that either.
yeah, exactly.
So the headlamps just make a lot of sense. Warm clothing, you know, in Colorado, that's why I included this photograph. I took this a few weeks ago up on Loveland Pass. And at 12,000 feet, it might be in the middle of the day, it might be hitting the 80s, mid 80s now in Denver. It's still snow and cold and windy up there. So you have to remember that in Colorado, that you have to have those warm clothes with you. I do keep extra clothes in my car. I always have a hat and gloves in every one of my camera bags. You want to make sure you have something that's windproof, just things that are warm socks, warm gloves, warm layers, different shirts and jackets, winter hat, gloves, boots or hiking shoes. You are going to be out in the dark. You don't want to be stubbing your toe out there in sandals. So I always do recommend to always have closed-toed shoes and something that supports your ankle. Because again, we're in the dark. You want to do everything possible to not have anything happen when you're out there. Rain gear can be very helpful, especially as we get into later into the season, where we can have some of those monsoon storms that come through. And of course, that's a little bit of a catch-22, because if it's raining, you're probably not going to be out for night photography. But we do have storms that clear out fairly quickly, so you might be driving somewhere waiting for the rain to stop to get those clear skies. Water and snacks, always good to have that kind of thing with you. First aid kit. It has happened where, you know, you stub a toe, you drop to a knee, you get a little boo-boo on the knee or something. Make sure you have a cell phone, a charged cell phone, and a tracking device. A lens warmer. This is something that, especially if you're going to do any sort of long exposure outdoors in the dark, at night when it's cold, is that your camera and your lens can actually create some heat. And what will wind up happening is that you can create some condensation either on the glass or the camera itself, especially if the temperatures are really, really cold. If you're doing some night photography in the wintertime, or if you're doing some night photography up at super high elevation. So that's something to consider. And then the other thing I always tell people, you know, people ask me, they're like, well, what do you do when you're doing a long exposure, or you're doing star trails? I bring a movie with me. I bring my iPad with me and I sit and watch a movie. I have a couple favorites that I like to watch, and just have those ready to go so that you can kind of keep yourself entertained, or bring some friends and just sit and chat and have, you know, enjoy the time outdoors. I'll
I lay
pass this
down.
back to Mike. Yeah, go
I,
ahead.
I lay down in the bed of my truck and just watch the sky. And there was
Yeah.
one night it was so cold that by the time my hour-long exposure was up, I was covered in frost. Okay, so planning your outing is important. And just of note, the galactic center of the Milky Way is most visible to us from March into October. It is slightly visible earlier in the year, but you're talking about just minutes. And if you look at timetables, to see the Milky Way in March, you have to be out at like 3 o'clock in the morning, and then your window for viewing is pretty short. So the longest viewing period is in June and July, which is what we're in right now. So the galactic core is always in the southern sky, and it swings from southeast to southwest as the season progresses. It even swings during a night. So when you get to see it, when you first see it in the sky, it will be in one position and then move towards the south or southwest as the night goes by. And then the angle of the galactic core changes during the season as well. So early in the season, like March and April, the Milky Way arches low over the eastern horizon, and that's a good time to get those nice panoramic shots. And then as the season progresses, the Milky Way gets more vertical, and it is something to keep in mind when you are planning what time of year to go out. So it's important that we have clear skies, although I have gotten some pretty cool shots with some clouds. So don't get discouraged if you have some clouds in your sky. And then the best times for viewing, of course, are on the new moon or near the new moon, a few days before and after. So the new moon for this month is happening on Thursday. And if you want the best visibility for the galactic core, avoid nights where there's a full moon or close to full moon. If you want to use the moon as a source of light to light up your foreground, then go out during those nights. Just know that you're not going to see as many stars. And then wind can be a big factor, especially around here. So if you're out in the cold and it's windy and your gear is moving around, it can be not so much fun. But one of the things that I have put in my kit for doing night photography is a stone bag or a rock bag. So it's like a little pouch that attaches to your tripod legs, and then you can put something in it like rocks or a bag, a small bag, to weigh your tripod down and keep things from moving around if you got some wind. Next. Okay, it's also important to scout out the area where you're going to photograph, and it's a much better idea to scout out that area during the daytime. So it's amazing how quickly you can get turned around or lost when it's dark. I remember going out with a friend of mine to a place that I'd been to 100 times, and we went in the dark and I couldn't find what I was looking for. We even had instances where one night I walked right past my truck. I knew where it was parked and I just couldn't see it when I was walking back. And after about 5 minutes of walking, I was like, wait a second, I think I've gone too far. So obviously I found my truck and made it back home. Use a planning app such as PhotoPills or Sun Surveyor. I'm not a huge app user, but I will say I do use PhotoPills, and PhotoPills is well worth the $10 to purchase it. There's all kinds of things you can do at PhotoPills, including finding the times for core visibility, and I think I have a slide that shows that as well. Make sure your batteries are charged not just for your camera, but for all of your other devices, and have some spares. If you're out in the cold, then put your spare batteries in an inside pocket to keep them warm, because they will drain more quickly in the cold. Clean your lenses, get some rest, prepare for the weather. And then an important safety tip is to tell someone where you're going and when you expect to return, especially if you're going by yourself. So I have a friend who's my safety guy. He basically knows anywhere I tell him that I'm going to go, he knows where I am. So I will say, hey, I'm going here, and this is when I expect to be back. And if he doesn't hear back from me when I get home, then he knows to call out the search party. So another important aspect of that is if you tell someone where you're going and you don't have a way to communicate with them after you leave, then don't change your plans. Because if you decide to go to point B instead of point A and your friend thinks you're at point A and something happened to you at point B, they're not going to find you. Okay. And then going back to what we mentioned earlier about having a cell phone or a tracking device, I use a device called Spot, and it's a subscription service. And if there's an emergency, then that connects me with 911 dispatch. And because it works on satellite technology, they will know exactly where I am if I call out to them.
Yeah,
Next.
it's important to keep in mind. I mean, when you're out photographing at night, there aren't a lot of people out. You typically
Yep.
don't see a lot of rangers. There aren't a lot of people on trails. So if something happens, you do have to be kind of take those extra steps to be prepared, know what to expect. It is important to kind of look at areas during the day so that you don't venture too far off and get yourself turned around at night. Because if you do have that situation, it's probably going to be several hours before you're going to be able to see somebody else out in the area again. So
Yep.
that is one of the big things about night photography.
Oh, here's the chart I was talking about. So all of this information, except for the very far right-hand column, came from PhotoPills. So what I do when I plan a year's worth of workshops, I will sit down with the calendar and determine what all the new moon dates are between March and October. And then I will go into PhotoPills and plug in each of those dates and look at the visibility time for the galactic core. The azimuth is your compass direction. Your elevation, of course, is how high it's going to be above the horizon. And then the right-hand column are just my notes. So what position the Milky Way is going to be in at that time of the year. So this is how I do my planning for my workshop season.
So, and as you can see from Mike's notes over here, the appearance of the Milky Way changes. So if you have a specific spot where you want to get a full arch of the Milky Way, you have to be out in the beginning of the season, and it tends to be a little bit colder then. And if you have a place where you want it to drop into a lake or you want it to drop in between a couple of mountains, it's going to be later in the season based on that direction of the where the Earth is basically sitting within the Milky Way.
Yeah, and also just to be clear, these are the visibility times for the galactic core, which is what most people want in their photographs. The Milky Way is visible all year round, and I have photographed it in the winter. But these are just the times for the galactic core. All right, this is you, Dawn.
So I had mentioned earlier that Colorado has 15 dark sky parks. So these are the places that are designated by the International Dark Sky Organization as dark sky locations. They have phenomenal visibility of the sky. They have really low light pollution. And I think we're pretty lucky here in Colorado that we have a lot of this opportunity. And a lot of these were designated, before things got really, really bright. So I just think it's a phenomenal opportunity that we have here in the state. So Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve, that is actually this photograph here. This was taken during blue hour. So this was a long exposure, single exposure, but long exposure to get some of the star trails. But this is the sand dunes, and this is actually photographed back in the wildlife area. So this is actually not photographed in the sand dunes, but it gives you an idea of what that region looks like. And I wanted to show just the enormity of the size of the sky there. I mean, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains are huge mountains, yet that sky is just huge when you get out into that valley. Dinosaur National Monument, Florissant National Monument, Heaven Weep, Jackson Lake State Park, which is the only dark sky park east of Interstate 25. So that's something that's kind of unique on the eastern side of Colorado. Curricanti National Recreation Area, Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park, Top of the Pines, Mesa Verde National Park, and Slumgullen Center. And then there are 5 dark sky communities. So we have Crestone, which is where this photograph was taken. So this is Crestone Peak down here in the Sangre de Cristos You can see the full arch of the Milky Way. This was taken earlier in the year. It was ridiculously cold. I think it was like -1 or -2 when I was out there photographing this. But so you've got Crestone, Nucla, Ridgeway, Norwood, Westcliff, and Silvercliff. Other Colorado locations. So these are some of the places that I've gone. I know Mike has gone to quite a few of these as well. Pawnee National Grassland is a great spot to do night photography. It has, unfortunately, over the 22 years that I've lived in the state, I've actually seen the night sky decrease out there. Now that there is a lot more drilling, there are a lot more wind turbines out there that actually create. Even though they only have one red light on each one of them, you'd be amazed at how much red light gets picked up by your camera. Mount Blue Sky has a lot of phenomenal places. It's very similar to Rocky Mountain National Park in that you can go up high, you can photograph to the east, get some of that light coming up from the Front Range, or actually photograph the lights of the Front Range. It's a really cool spot for photographing storms too, if that's something that you like. Picket Wire Canyon, Maroon Bells, Paint Mines. You do require that. Does require a permit down there. That's something that Mike does. He does a lot of workshops in there. If you're interested in photographing in there without having to get your own permit, Mike will take care of that for you. And then any location away from large amounts of light. I mean, like this is North Sterling State Park up in Northeast Colorado, where you do get a little bit of light pollution, but you actually do see the Milky Way. We were talking earlier about clouds in the sky. So there's some real faint clouds in here. I actually kind of like adding in clouds into some of my night photographs because the clouds reflect the light, and I like that blue and gold together. I think that's a nice combination in moderation. I don't want an overabundance of clouds, but I do like some. I think it adds a little bit of color in there. Anything you wanted to add there, Mike?
Yeah, somebody asked a question in chat about parks being closed and what the workaround is that there is for that. If a park is designated as a dark sky park, there's a good chance that they have accommodations set up for people to enjoy the dark skies. One example is fluorescent fossil beds. So fluorescent fossil beds used to be completely closed after dark, but once they got their dark sky park designation, the Hornbeck Ranch or Hornbeck Homestead area is open to the public all night long. So you can go there and photograph and enjoy the dark skies. Other places like the example of the paint mines, they do allow night activities, but only by permit. So the paint mines are not a designated dark sky park. And I've actually started a conversation to try to get that designation. Not sure if that will happen, but the way they have worked around this is the permit system, and they only issue one permit per night. So if you do get a permit, you should be the only people out in the entire park. So it's a great place to enjoy the night sky.
Something else to consider, most state parks close at 10 o'clock at night. So to actually access them after, sometimes, especially as you get closer to the new moon, you might have some time. And as we get later into the summer, when sunset's a little bit earlier in the evening, you might have some time between 8, 9, and 10 to have some dark skies. After that 10 o'clock, you really do need to make sure that you're actually camping there, because once you're camping there, then you have access into the park. But with any of these places, especially if there's people around, always try to remember, be conscientious of who is out there. Try not to make too much noise, moving around. I'm sure we all have stories of having our alarms on our cars go off by mistake, and it's unintentional. And but we do want to make sure that we are sensitive. Not everybody's into being out at night, so we want to be just conscientious of who's out there at night that we don't want to disturb. So one of the things that when you're thinking about if you want to travel outside of Colorado, or if you're trying to find a dark sky location, I actually use this website. These are called light pollution maps, and it's at darksitefinder.com. And basically what it's telling you is that as these spots get red and bright white, So like out here in the Northeast, we're in New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, up here to, closer to Boston, Washington, D.C. These areas have very, very little, or I should say they have a lot of light pollution and very little visibility of the night sky. But as you get out here to the west, where things are dark gray, almost black, those are the really, really dark places. So this is a closer look at what Colorado looks like. So you can see out here, this is the Pawnee grassland up here in Northeast Colorado. Sterling has a little bit of light pollution around it, but Sterling Lake State Park is a little bit north of it. That's this lake that's right here. So you can see that that's kind of in a real light blue area, so not too bad. Obviously, the Denver area has a ton of light pollution. Up here in Estes Park, there's a little bit of yellow right there in Estes, but really quickly that light drops off. And this is all the Continental Divide. So as soon as you get over the Continental Divide, the western half of Colorado is pretty dark, and there's a lot of content down, or a lot of dark skies down there. Did you want to add anything on that, Mike?
No, that's good.
And then dark sky places. So this is the map at darksky.org. So it'll actually show you there are other locations that are dark sky certified. So these can be really good spots to plan trips out to if you want to go someplace beyond Colorado. Do you want to talk about different opportunities?
Yeah, but I think you should talk about this
You
photo.
want me to start? So this is a photo taken in, I actually call this Colors of the Night. This was a photograph that I did in Rocky Mountain National Park up on Trail Ridge Road. And there's actually northern lights in here. I was not anticipating it. Real faint. I'm not saying that this is some stellar northern lights photograph, but there's a little bit of pink down there. But there's also a lot of this air glow. We mentioned that earlier. That is something that shows up a lot of times in photographs. And then obviously the colors of the Milky Way. The Milky Way itself has quite a bit of color too. And then you get a little bit of the light pollution. That's this golden light reflecting off the clouds here. And then you can do different things, whether you want to have an exposure for your foreground or you want to just silhouette it out. My preference on this type of photograph was to actually silhouette it out, because I just want the viewer's eye to go right into the Milky Way. Just look at all these different things in here. I mean, there's a meteor. I think there was 1 or 2 meteors in here. I think this one up here was a satellite. So there's just a lot going on in here. But this was 12 vertical frames, and it took me 4 years to get this photograph. So as we mentioned earlier, the arc of the Milky Way is only visible at a certain time of year, and Trail Ridge Road isn't typically open that time of year. So I have a very short window of time in June to get up there after Trail Ridge Road opens to actually be there. But I have to have clear weather. My preference is to not have wind. I have to have the time available. I have to make sure that I don't have something going on that's preventing me from staying up all night. And then one year, I don't know what I did, but when I got home to actually edit the photos together, it made a pyramid instead of an arc. And I assume that was because I wasn't level, even though I thought I was out in the dark. But that goes to show, we're doing these things in the dark. We think we're catching things, so you have to be really careful. And so I had to wait a whole nother year again before the conditions were right to capture this. And I did finally capture the whole image last year. So I photographed this at 15 seconds, f2.8, ISO 3200. Those are my most common settings for night sky photography. That kind of tends to be my default. And I was at 24 millimeters. That was the widest this particular lens. This was on the 24 to 70 lens, and it was 12 vertical frames stitched together. What were you going to say, Mike?
Oh, you bring up some good points. One thing that I like to remind people of or let them know about with night sky photography is that this isn't the type of photography that you can practice all the time. It's not like you can just walk out your door and get some shots. You have to be in a dark sky place. You have to have good conditions. And like you mentioned, it took you 4 years to get this photograph. I've been working on a similar photograph at the paint mines, and I think my last one was my best one yet. But since I'm so picky with my night photography, it's still not as perfect as I want it to be. And then also you're doing these things in the dark. And if you think it's hard to figure out how to do stuff when it's light out, it's a lot harder to do things when you're in the dark. And so that's where it comes in handy to be around people like Dawn or myself. If you take a workshop, or some good friends who are knowledgeable about all things photography, is that if something goes wrong, it's sometimes really hard to figure out how to fix it when you're in the dark. I had a student on one of my most recent workshops who had some setting that was preventing him from getting long exposures, and he and I just had to take the time to step away from everybody and figure out what was going on. But a lot of times those things will end your night, even some of the simplest things like forgetting to charge your battery, or leaving something at home. I'm guilty of that. But those things can prevent you from getting the photos that you want and practicing if you really need to practice. And I'll be the first to admit that this is something that has taken me a really long time to get to the point where I feel comfortable with the photos that I get now every time I go out, because it's the learning curve is I wouldn't call it steep, I would call it extended. Okay, this is one of my shots. So one of the opportunities you have are meteor showers, and the best meteor showers of the year are the Perseids in August and the Geminids in December. And from my experience, the last few years, the Geminids have been by far the most active. But the drawback to the Geminids is that for us, it's in the winter, and it's really cold a lot of times. So I don't think it was too bad this particular night, but that's one of the meteors that I caught. And this happens to be a blend, one photo for the sky and one photo for the foreground, and you can see my settings there. But meteors are just amazing, even if you don't capture any on camera. Sometimes it's hard. You can take hundreds of shots and still not get any on your camera. But just to be out there and to watch that happen is pretty spectacular in itself.
And there's a couple of things I'll add for meteor showers. One, most meteors are named for the constellation that the meteors appear to originate out of. So, for example, the Perseids meteor shower comes out of Perseus, which is kind of in the northern sky. So you want to try, as you're planning these things, and night photography is so much about planning prior to being out there. I kind of think of it as half of it is taking the photo at night. There's another half about editing it, but the first half is really about, and I realize that's three halves and that doesn't add up, right? But the first half is really about planning, knowing where to be, knowing what your location is, and knowing if, will the center of the Milky Way be where you want it to be? You can't change it. Do you have the right position to maybe see the meteors, the bulk of the meteors? The December meteor shower is just phenomenal because they tend to be long, streaky meteors. The Perseids is one that people tend to like for two reasons. Mike's already mentioned. One, it tends to be warmer, so you're out there when the weather's a little bit nicer, but it's also the one of the most abundant. So it has close to 100 meteors an hour. So when photographing these showers, you obviously you cannot see the meteor and hit your shutter button. So you have to leave, this goes back to the remote shutter, you just leave it open and let the camera just run. Just get as many frames as you can and then start looking at them later to see which ones you actually capture.
Yeah, that's another
But
good point. I
yeah,
just I used my remote, lock in the shutter button, make sure that I have do some test shots, make sure I have my settings and my composition the way I want it, and then just lock in the shutter button and let the camera just continuously take photographs.
Back to that movie watching again.
Or watch for the meteors.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I'm not avoiding those things by any means. One of the things that a lot of times when people talk about astrophotography, they consider we all say that go out in the new moon and go out in a dark night. Astrophotography involves the full moon too. There's things that you can think of. Where's the moon going to set? Is that full moon going to set in a really interesting location? Like one of the places I think of is Horsetooth Mountain in Fort Collins. There are 2 times of the year where the full moon will actually set or will rise behind Horsetooth Rock, up at Horsetooth Reservoir in the northwest part of Fort Collins. I mean, that's kind of cool. So there's things that you can think of too that don't just say, oh, I completely botched the timing. Well, maybe there's something with the full moon that you can do that could be really interesting. I always like photographing the moon through trees. This one I actually took the focal point on the moon, and that's why these trees are blurred out. You can actually blend 2 images together where you take a focal point on the trees and one on the moon, do an exposure for the moon. So there's different ways that you can do that as well.
Yeah, what I like to do is plan a photo outing where the moon is rising about 30 minutes prior to sunset. And sometimes that happens the night before the full moon, or even 2 nights before the full moon. And that way you can get some nice sunset colors. And then one of my rules is after the moon gets up high enough and the sky is dark enough, then use the moon as a light source. So you can photograph rock formations and other things under the light of the moon. And if you plan it, then you can get photos of your foreground that are moonlit, and then photos of your sky after the moon sets. Comets. We've had a couple of comets recently that we have been able to photograph, and that also requires some planning, knowing where the comet is in the sky, because sometimes they're not visible to the naked eye. And this was the one we had a couple years ago. I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, the picture on the left is at one of the locations I use in Westcliff for my workshops, and you can see the comet just below the tail of the windmill. And that streak in the sky is a fireball. This was the first shot that I took, and I was actually just setting up my camera and getting my composition, and I just took a test shot to test my exposure, and this fireball came streaking across the sky, and I was lucky enough to capture it. And then the picture on the right is just a closer view of that comet. But
Yeah.
if you're on Facebook or anything like that, and you're in any of the astrophotography groups, once a comet becomes visible or is about to, you'll hear all about it, and then you'll start seeing all the pictures, and then you can learn where to look for it in the night sky or in the morning sky.
There have been a few interesting comets. This was Neowise that was
Oh,
that was
that's
in
right. Yeah,
2020. Yeah, that was in 2020, the year that kept on giving. So that was a really interesting comet. And then we had one earlier this year that was called the Green Devil, or the Horn
Devil's
Devil, or
Comet. Yeah.
Devil's Comet, yeah, something like that. Because apparently, if you look at it really closely with a telescope, it actually looked like it had horns on
Mhm.
it, which are apparently really rocks shedding off of it or something. I think I
Oh,
had read,
cool.
but so yeah, so there are different interesting ones out there. So another thing that you can do in the night sky are star trails, and there are 2 ways to do this. It used to be that you actually had to do a really long exposure to get the trails, to actually see the trails. But what that actually created was a lot of noise within your photograph, and that was really difficult to deal with. Now that software has improved tremendously for night photography, now the better way to do that is to actually take a series of frames over the course, and it's up to you however long you want to have that. I believe this one was, so it was So the foreground was 84 seconds, it was 80 frames. So if I did 80 frames at 15 seconds, you can calculate out the length of time on that. So you're talking, so is that 20 minutes? But you can do things that are like an hour long or 2 hours long. You just want to consider that the longer you do, the more light you're going to have show up in those frames from stars. So you have to adjust for that. But then you have to take those frames and then merge them together into, I use Photoshop. There are some other pieces of software out there like StarStax that will actually merge these files together for you. And then in this one, I've actually did a different exposure for the foreground so that this wasn't silhouetted out, so that you could see some of these cottonwood trees and the detail in the mountains in that foreground. The other thing you want to consider when you are doing foreground exposures is that you want to try to find something that has a pretty tight line along the top. I have done it where I've used trees, but it can be really difficult to get in between all of those trees and to blend those together properly. So this just makes it a lot easier, a little bit more straightforward in selecting that foreground area and then blending it together with the star trails. The one thing I do get asked about is how do you create that circular effect to actually see the circle? So this is the North Star. If you photograph a star trail, if you take that series of frames and have the North Star within that frame, all the stars will appear to spin around it. You can take star trails any place in the sky, but the shape of those star trails will change depending upon where you are in orientation to the North Star. And then there is a line through here. You can see I actually had a plane come through. No, actually, that's probably a satellite. Now that I look at it, it doesn't have the green and red on it. Excuse me. That's probably a satellite going through. It's up to you whether you want to remove that. You'd have to go through each frame to actually take that out. I was just a choice of mine not to deal with that. To me, it's a little bit more representative of what happens out there at night. Anything you want to add on star trails, Mike?
This is one of the areas where we differ. I still prefer to do the single long exposure, and that's where I can take time to step away from my camera. And that's one of the things that I encourage people to do when they're under such an amazing sky, is to take some time and just enjoy what you're viewing. But I do like the single exposures. I've tried both ways, the stitching together, and it's just my personal preference that I like the way my pictures look when I do a single exposure. And one of the things that you can do with those long exposures is use your in-camera noise reduction function. But if you take a really long exposure, that doubles the amount of time that your camera is working. So that may be the last shot of your night or the last shot before you move to a different location. You do not want that feature on if you're doing a photo like Dawn is showing you here, where you're stitching star trails together. So for example, with what she did here was 15-second exposures. If you have that noise reduction function on, the camera is going to be working for another 15 seconds. So you'll have a 15-second gap between each of the little star trails that you capture. So that defeats the purpose of doing this. So if you are going to do shorter exposures to stitch together later, turn that noise reduction function off.
The other thing too that I'll add, although we don't have any representation of it in here, these 80 frames, I actually made a time lapse of this scene from those same 80 frames too. So it does give you that benefit too. You have some flexibility in how you use those files, and the time lapse editing process can be fun to see that change.
That's one of the fun things you can do with just continually shooting a series of images like this. One of the arguments that I have been given for using the shorter exposures is that, oh, well, if you kick your tripod, then you can fix it. And my first thought was, what are you doing standing next to your tripod? Don't stand next to your tripod if you're going to be doing a long series of photos to stitch together or a long single exposure. Just set up your camera, let it go, and move away from it so that you don't have an accident and you don't accidentally bump into your camera. Okay. All the other opportunities are photographing deep sky objects. And this is about as close to deep sky that I've ever gotten. Some people really do enjoy photographing the nebula and things like that. And this is a photo with my Nomad tracker. It's a 2-minute exposure with my 24 to 105, zoomed in all the way at 105, and also shot cropped. And so you can see the 3 stars across the top that make up Orion's belt. And then you can see the Orion Nebula in the bottom left-hand corner. So this is another fun thing that you can do if you're into this kind of stuff. And you can see lots of spectacular photos of really cool objects in the sky all over Facebook and Instagram.
So another thing that has been really, really active this year in the night sky are northern lights. So this was a photo that I captured. This is not Colorado. This was photographed in Ohio on Lake Erie. This is Detroit. This is all these this noise, this light pollution. This is a good example of light pollution. This is Detroit up here in the yellow. But this was on the south side of Lake Erie, looking north. During the May 10th to 11th Northern Lights display. So this is something else that, you know, we were talking about apps earlier. I actually do have 2 or 3 different apps on my phone that actually will give me notifications if it predicts Northern Lights to be strong in the location where the GPS is picking that I am located. So in Colorado, we actually have been seeing them. I know there have been a lot of people photographed them that night. I know, Mike, I think you were out that night actually capturing some photographs. So it is very, very rare to see them in Colorado. When we see them in Colorado, it tends to be the pinks and purples because we're seeing the higher level. We don't always have the green isn't always strong enough to rise high enough so that we can see them this far south. But keep an eye out for them because this year and next year are the top of the 11-year cycle. So things should be peaking, and I won't get into all the technical details about what's happening with the sun, but right now we are at the peak of an 11-year cycle, so that the northern lights should be pretty prominent and frequent, more frequent than normal, at least for the next year or so. They're talking about through next summer.
Cool.
The other thing to consider when you're photographing northern lights is that so my go-to time for photographing night skies, Milky Way, stars, things like that is 15 seconds. It depends on the light conditions. I might shorten and I might lengthen it. I don't want to lengthen it too much longer because you start to get trails in your stars if you go any longer than like 15 or 20 seconds. But with the northern lights, you're trying to catch all this dancing that goes on, these streaks that come up. So you actually want to go shorter. So you have to go down. I usually recommend between, a second to 10 seconds, depending upon how bright they are. There really isn't a flat, this is the right exposure, the right length of time. But you do need to kind of find that right length of time. I have found somewhere between 1 and 10 works pretty well in most situations. And then you want to adjust your settings otherwise so you have enough light coming in to capture that scene. You going to add, Mike?
Yeah, that day I was watching not only the local weather forecast, but the space weather forecast. So NOAA, NOAA, if you go on their website, they have a special page for space weather, which shows the prediction of the aurora activity. And then the app that I have is called, what is it called? Aurora. I just had it.
There's Aurora forecast, and then there is Aurora. I'll put it in the chat so that we don't hold
Yeah.
things up.
Yeah, the name on this just disappeared on me, but it'll give you, you turn it on and you look for the local forecast and it'll tell you what your chances of are seeing the aurora. And there's some good Facebook groups out there too that usually for us in Colorado, if people are showing reports of seeing it in places like Montana or North Dakota, there's a good chance that we'll see it too. It might be really low on the horizon, but there's a possibility that we'll have that opportunity as well. That was a really fun night. That was real. And the picture behind me, that was taken last year in April. And I just so happened to have a session scheduled with a client out in Westcliff. And there was a forecast of heavy aurora activity. And when I got there, I just set up my camera and took a quick shot. This was the first shot that I got. I couldn't see the colors with my own eyes, but the camera picked them up, and that's a pretty common occurrence as well.
All right.
So another opportunity is to photograph the space station or different satellites. So I have an app that's called ISS Detector, and it's really fun because you can get notified as to when the space station is going to be making a flyby. And you can even look up, what's coming if you're out photographing at night, and then you can plan your shot. So this is actually a blend of 10 different photographs, each at 20 seconds long, to stitch together this long trail that the space station made just before sunrise. Okay, so let's quickly run through some basic camera settings. So on your lens, your aperture is going to be wide open or close to it. Again, depends on your lens. You may do better closing down your aperture a third of a stop or 2/3 stops instead of shooting at the edge of your optics. Shutter speeds typically in the 15 to 20 second range. Another reason to buy photo pills is to get the NPF calculator, which shows you for your lens and camera combination the optimum time for eliminating movement in your stars. And for my camera, my R6 with my 15 to 30, it's around 19 seconds. So I have a bulb timer in my camera that I can just set for 19 seconds, and instead of using 15 or 20. ISOs in the range from 1600 to 6400. Usually it depends on how dark your sky is. And then I encourage you to experiment with these settings. Don't just get stuck with one group of settings the entire night that you're out. Experiment, because sometimes it's hard to tell on the back of your camera what's working better than something else, and you have to look at the photos on your computer. That high ISO noise reduction function that is one of the noise reduction features on your camera. For most cameras, that particular one works for JPEGs only, and you should be shooting in RAW, so you can turn that one off. The other noise reduction function is called long exposure noise reduction, and I say that one's optional. So if you're doing single shots, it's not a bad idea to have it on. It will reduce some of the noise. It will also get rid of some hot pixels if you have them. But if you're doing something like Dawn showed earlier, the shorter exposure to later stitch together or longer star trails, definitely turn it off. White balance, I prefer a white balance of 3800K. That is what I feel, to me, gives me the most natural look to the sky. You also want to turn off image stabilization or vibration reduction, if you have that on your lens. If you have that on and your camera is on a tripod, what you're going to end up with is stars that look like squiggly lines. So what that feature does is it uses a gyroscope to stabilize your camera when you're hand holding it. So if you're on a tripod and there's no movement, the camera is going to induce some movement, and then as a result, your stars won't be nice points of light. Also, another thing, if you are going to be switching from shooting stars as points of light, meaning little or no movement in the stars, to star trails, it's important to be able to learn how to calculate what your equivalent exposure will be for that long exposure. So let's say you take 16-minute exposure, you don't want to wait 16 minutes to figure out you made a mistake. So what I recommend is starting out with a 15 or 30-second exposure, and then you can calculate from there based on how long your star trail exposure is going to be, what you need to do to adjust your settings. So I actually have a video about this on my YouTube channel if you want to check it out. We're not going to go into detail on that today. All right, so some of the challenges that we have, number one, I think somebody even mentioned it earlier, is focusing. So how do you focus in the dark? So one thing you can do is pre-focus. So if you're out there before it gets dark, you can focus on something far off in the distance and then flip the switch on your lens from auto to manual. Some people will even use a piece of painter's tape on their focus ring to make sure that it doesn't move. You have to be careful with that method though, because if you switch to autofocus and you don't remove that piece of tape, you can cause a problem with your lens. Another method after dark is to say maybe you have a light on a house off in the distance. I even did this last month out in Westcliff with one location, the location with the windmill. That 24 to 105 can be hard for me to focus sometimes. So a truck drove by on the highway that was near us, and I followed the truck as far as I could and focused on it when it was the furthest away from me, using my autofocus, then flip my switch to manual focus. If the moon's out, you can focus on the moon. That's an easy one. You can also use your live view, zoom in on the brightest stars that are in the sky, optically zoom in, and then manually turn your focus ring until those stars get to be the smallest points of light possible. And then a really cool feature on the mirrorless cameras is something called focus peaking. And it's a feature that is used when you're manually focusing. What it does is it allows you to choose a color like white or yellow or red. I use red because it's easier to see in the dark. When those things that you're focusing on come into focus, they'll turn that color. So when I'm trying to focus on stars, I'll watch for the stars to turn red, and then I know that they're in focus. So it's a really cool feature. Setting your composition can be really challenging too. So one little hack is to turn your ISO up as high as it can go, and then just do like a 3-second exposure, so you don't have to wait 15 or 20 seconds to see what you captured. You're not going to be able to use that photo for anything other than judging what's in your composition. So once you get that lined up, then turn your ISO back down to whatever you need to set it for, and also your shutter time. Light pollution and weather can also cause some challenges. So sometimes, like Dawn showed in one of her photos, a little bit of light pollution can look really cool, especially if you've got something silhouetted. So you can position yourself relative to that ball of light pollution and put it behind something that you're trying to photograph. And then, of course, the weather, one of the things that I have seen here in Colorado is how quickly the weather changes. So I don't put a whole lot of stock into weather apps because they're usually wrong. And I have seen skies clear in a matter of minutes. And there's something about the 2 a.m. hour that I've seen things just magically clear up at 2 a.m. So I recommend that if you're out to stay out till at least 2. Vehicles and airplanes can be very troublesome for your photos, lighting up things that you don't want lit up, and there always seems to be airplanes somewhere. We were out photographing once many miles east of here, and we were obviously on the approach to DIA because literally every 2 minutes there was an airplane going by. Another issue is noise. So with the high ISOs, noise can be a problem. So the process of stacking to eliminate noise can be one solution. The in-camera noise reduction function that I mentioned earlier is another. And then the software programs are, they have, like denoise, and the new denoise AI that's in Lightroom and Camera Raw works really well. So I'm less concerned about noise than I am about the composition and the other qualities of my images. And then star movement is an issue as well. So the longer your exposure, the more likely you're going to have movement in your stars. The longer the focal length of your lens, the shorter the amount of time it takes to see that movement in the stars. And that's where trackers come in. So using a tracker, the tracker rotates to counteract the rotation of the Earth and allows you to get much longer exposures with longer focal length lenses. And the challenge to tracking, though, is that you have to get good at blending images because you have to take photos of your foreground without the tracking on, so that everything in your foreground is nice and sharp and not fuzzy. And then you have to take photos for your sky and then blend those two together. Anything else you want to add, Dawn?
Not that I can think of. I mean, we've shown a couple of photos already that have vehicles and airplanes in them. Satellites are the other one that tend to be out in the sky. There are
Yeah.
a lot of satellites out there nowadays.
Yeah,
So
especially early in the evening, like just after sunset and just before sunrise, because of the angle of the sun, you can see the satellites more.
yeah. So it's and as I mentioned earlier, it's up to you whether, as the photographer that owns that photo and is taking that photo, whether you want to keep them in or take them out. I'm not a big fan of keeping airplanes in because they do have the red and green lights on the wings, so you tend to see that color. The other things, because they're white, they tend to not bother me as much depending upon where they are within the photograph.
Ah, oh, so this is the section where we talk about our photos. All
So
right.
these are our stories.
Yeah, these are
So
our
there's always good stories at night, lots of good
always
stories.
good stories and good stories to tell at night too, like ghost stories. So this is the same photo that's in my background, and I mentioned earlier that this was taken last year in April. We had a good storm a month earlier, and I was really upset with myself for missing it. And then we had this one in April of last year, and it was just by luck that I had this session lined up with a client, and it was pretty amazing. I saw color in the sky until sunrise, and it was a great experience. So this particular photo, I could see the the light columns in the sky, but I couldn't see the colors at the time. And I just set up the camera and took a shot and was amazed at what I saw. So, and then I called my client and tried to give him directions to where I was. And finding the places that I use in Westcliff is a challenge in the dark. So what I did was I set up my camera, I left it there and let it run so I could do a time lapse. And then I drove into town and met him and picked him up and brought him back. So
Oh my gosh.
that's the way that worked out. So it was a really, really fun night.
Wow.
This is an example of a single exposure photograph. So there's good opportunities for you to get good photographs with just a single exposure. And this is where I recommend that if you're starting out with night photography, this is where I recommend you start. I see lots of people on Facebook groups, talking about stacking 100 pictures and all this stuff. And I think it's really important to not put the cart in front of the horse, to learn the basics and to get good at doing single exposures before you move on to other things. So this was a 20-second exposure, closed down to 3.5 at ISO 6400. And this was taken the same night as the previous photo. And you see that pink streak of color in the sky. I learned later that that's the stable auroric red that is visible to the south when the northern lights are active. So it was in that same position for a very, very long time.
And I would completely agree with Mike. My very first night photo outing, I was struggling with trying to get things sharp. And, I look back at those, I still have those photos, and stars are blown out and my exposures were wrong. But it really does make things easier to kind of take things in baby steps. Take them as a single exposure, work on getting the sky exposed properly. Don't worry. So, you just silhouette out what's on the landscape, and then work into a double exposure. So you take an exposure for the sky, an exposure for the foreground, and then blend them together. And then you can start getting into things like, taking 40, 50, 60 frames and blending them into Photoshop as layers to create star trails. And then you can get into star trackers. And that process is years, it's just years of work. The Milky Way season is a very short season for us. Night photography is very limited on how many nights are available each month, because you do need dark skies, you need good weather, and things don't always come together the way that you hope they do. So it's something to definitely be patient with and just take it one thing at a time, master each phase of that learning process.
Yeah, be patient with yourself. I mean, I look at pictures that I took a few years ago and I'm like, ugh, So one of the biggest game changers for me was switching to using the now it just slipped my mind. The rule for figuring out your exposure time, the NPF rule. Using that from the PhotoPills calculator instead of the 500 rule. The 500 rule does not work for digital cameras. So if somebody tells you to use the 500 rule, tell them, sorry, I use the NPF rule. Huge game changer with the way my photos look. And then if you want to know what airplanes look like, there's a couple of airplanes in that photo. My record for number of airplanes, I think, is 16 in one photo. So
yeah, this down here on the bottom right, it's an airplane. See how you get that, there's dots.
You get the dotted lines. That's one of the ways you can tell it's airplane. Okay, next one. Oh, so here's the stable red arc that was visible on May 10th to the south. So this is a panorama with 9 vertical frames, each 15 seconds at ISO 6400. This was amazing. And what really kind of blew me away was how this pinkish glow was in the sky the whole time that we were there. If I turned my camera, and I couldn't really see it with my eyes, but if I turned my camera to the south, the sky was all pink and or red, and it was not the northern lights. So this is what's visible when the aurora is active if you're looking to the south. And I like the way the light is hitting the grass there. There were no artificial lights used in making this photo. So it was just I took a panorama looking to the north, and then I turned around and I took a panorama looking to the south, and this is the one to the south. Next. Okay, so here is a tracked and blended image. And this was taken actually last month on my last workshop in Westcliff. And I did one shot for the foreground. What I like to do normally when I do blended images is have the exposure time for my foreground the same as the exposure time for my background, because then they seem to blend more easily and look more natural. This one was a little bit different because I wanted the windmill in silhouette. So I did a 2-minute exposure at f4 and ISO 400 to reduce the noise. And then for my sky, this was on my Star Adventure tracker. I have a problem with leaving my laser for my Nomad at home. So that's one of the things that, make sure you have all your stuff with you. I'm guilty of leaving things at home. So the sky photo was an 8-minute exposure, f4 ISO 400, and I blended these together in Photoshop. The new tools for selecting skies in Photoshop are really, really good. But you also have to be good at working with layers and masks. Okay. Here's another track blend. This is the spot. You can see the 3 peaks in the lower left. This is the spot that has the 3 peaks that inspired the name of my business. And this was last year in September, I think it was, late September. And I have to say, this is one of the darkest places I have ever been in. And this is the image that's now on my new business card. And I was here by myself. I went with a couple friends, but they left just after it got dark. And I wandered into the woods by myself, carrying all my gear. And it was a very pleasant night and super, super dark. I remember another instance when I had some friends from Pueblo with me in Westcliff, and I brought them out just to show them how dark it was at this location. And then one of them says, I can still remember that image in my mind of you just wandering off into the dark and disappearing. So again, I enjoy being out in the dark and find peace in the dark. So that's the core of the Milky Way there in the upper right. And so both the foreground and the sky have the same exposure value. And this was a 2-minute exposure with my MSM rotator. Next. So this is an untracked panorama, and this is 10 vertical frames, each at f3.5, 19 seconds, and ISO 6400. This was taken on Christmas Day morning, and I had gone to Westcliff to make a video and visit all of the locations that I shoot from. And while out here at the windmill, I decided to do a panorama, and you can see the Milky Way kind of making a weird looking art. So you'd notice that the core is not visible. So this is it looks kind of weird, oddly shaped, but This is what happened when I stitched the photos together. And you can see the green and the magenta colors towards the horizon, and that's air glow. And we typically get a lot of air glow out in the West Cliff area, which is cool to see in your photographs. This is a tracked panorama, and 4 frames, vertical frames for the sky, f4 3 minutes, and ISO 800. They were tracked with my Star Adventurer. The foreground, longer exposure so that I could get the detail in the mountains and the trees. So if you're going to be doing this type of photography and blend a foreground with the sky, you can do a much longer exposure for your foreground so that you can get those details, and then it tends to blend quite nicely with your sky. That one cloud, there was that one cloud that was right over the core of the Milky Way that just would not go away. Notice there's no clouds anywhere else, other than right there. So, okay, next one. All right, so this is a blue hour blend. It's another technique that you can use. It's not always the most practical, because if you're not in a place during blue hour, then you don't have this opportunity. But I shot this is a location I have access to for my Paint Minds workshops. And so I took the foreground shot of the house during the blue hour. And that was f4 30 seconds at ISO 1600. And then the sky image was a 2-minute exposure with my my MSM rotator f3.2 at ISO 800. So I find the blue hour blends a little bit challenging because it can be difficult to make it look natural. I've seen lots of photos that are blue hour blends where the foreground it looks like it was taken during the day, and then the sky just doesn't seem to blend well with it. But this was one that I had to do some considerable work with when putting it together in Photoshop. Next. Here's another blue hour blend, and this one comes with a story. So this was my my public service announcement about bears. So I was in this location. My plan was to stay there all night and until sunrise, and then take a little hike, and then take a nap before going home. So I drove in. It's a very long drive to get to this place, and on the way in, I saw a bear. And so I had bear on my mind, and I'm shooting away, and it's about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I had this little pop-up tent with me. And because it had rained before I got there, everything was wet, and I didn't have a chair with me. So I got a little tired, and I crawled into the tent just to lay down for a little while. And after a few minutes, I heard this really loud growl. And it's one of the only times I've been afraid or scared out in the night. And I was biting my fingernails, just curled up in the fetal position, waiting for the claw to come through the side of the tent and thinking, this is it. This is how it ends for me, right? And then I heard the growling noise again. It turned out it was my stomach. And so I immediately started laughing. And when you're out in the dark, sounds are amplified, and things that you hear in your mind, they're much bigger. They're coming from much bigger objects than they really are. So I was also concerned because I had some food with me. And so after I realized it was my stomach, I just laughed it off, and I ate something. So, but this again is blue hour blend. F11 4 seconds at ISO 200 for the foreground, and then F3 4 minutes.
I
And
don't know when this ends. Guess at
yeah.
9. I don't know.
and ISO 800 for the sky. All right.
All right. So we have just a few more slides left. I have a few images to share with some interesting stories and how the photos were captured. Then we'll be happy to answer any questions if we haven't answered them already. So this is another panoramic. This is 8 vertical images stitched together. This is Devil's Tower. This is not Colorado. This is Devil's Tower up in Wyoming. If you're familiar with the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, this is that monolith up in Wyoming that was featured prominently in that movie. But there are certain times of the year where you can get really nice Milky Way arches over Devil's Tower. This is, so again, I've silhouetted all of this. There was a little bit of light pollution from a car leaving the parking lot that actually gave a little bit of light on the tower itself. So I like just a little bit of subtle hint, because then you start to see the streaks in the rock on that. But I was actually up there during a meteor shower, and you can see all the meteors kind of splashing through the photo. So I like that. And I also like the color across this, and that's something that I was going to point out, that as you edit these in post-processing, I think all of us see the night sky as dark, but there's a lot of color out there. And I think all of us have, and I even find, depending upon my mood when I'm editing things, is that I edit the colors a little bit differently. Sometimes I really like to see a lot of the pinks and oranges in the core of the Milky Way. Other times I like to have more of the blues. I notice, Mike likes a lot of the blue tones. I think we all have styles to our photograph, and I wouldn't say any one is right, other than not making it look garish or not accurate, because our cameras do pick up a lot of color. There is a lot of color in the sky. So that was Devil's Tower. This was actually my first Northern Lights photograph. This is not the first time I saw the Northern Lights, but it's the first time I photographed them. And I wanted to show this because we talked a little bit about the length of time for Northern Lights. This is actually the moon. This is the moon rising. But this is, so all that green are Northern Lights, and that's 25 seconds. And you can see how it just becomes a wash of green. You lose the detail in the Northern Lights. So I wanted to show this as kind of an example of what you really don't want to do if you happen to have an opportunity to photograph Northern Lights. There are a lot of things I could have done. I would have brought the ISO down. I definitely would have shortened the time on it. The other thing is that, when you have a harbor and you have a lot of this human light now in that photograph, you have to consider that, right? I did take a series. This was a blended HDR image, but I wanted to point that aspect out for you. In contrast, this is 8 seconds. So that previous one was 25 seconds. This one's 8 seconds. And now you can see all the streaks in the sky. This was taken up in Denali National Park, which is a phenomenal place to go photograph Northern Lights. This was actually from the campground where I was staying. I had gone back to to Riley campground. For anybody that's familiar with Denali, I had gone back to Riley store and a campground. They have they have showers and stuff there. So I went back there to take care of, getting food and getting a shower before I went back to the campsite. But they were doing some construction overnight. And so I actually got stopped in the construction. I think they were saying it was like a 30-minute wait. And as I was sitting there, I actually fell asleep. And if you've ever been to Alaska in the summer, you know that you just get exhausted. You just go and go and go and go. And that was kind of what was happening to me. So I wound up falling asleep in the car while I was sitting there waiting for the construction. And the woman told me, she's like, I let a couple passes go. She's like, you just look so tired. So, but what wound up happening is that when I got back to the campsite, I looked up at the sky. There was this little bit of a faint green kind of moving in the sky. And I'm like, is that what, like, I hadn't been paying attention to, I was really up there to photograph wildlife, and I hadn't really been paying much attention to the forecast for the Northern Lights. And all of a sudden the sky just exploded and all these waves and curtains of color. And so, keep an eye out when you're out at night. Think about what might be around. Take a peek at the sky. If it's a clear night or a cold night, and the clouds dissipate, always have that camera with you. You'd be surprised what you might be able to capture. This is, I think, probably the same night Mike mentioned earlier last year in April with the Northern Lights. This is up in Rocky Mountain National Park. I was out with a client, and it lasted all night long. We stayed out from about 9 o'clock at night till nearly sunrise. He was very, very much interested in photographing the Milky Way and the stars. And I'm like, dude, we've got Northern Lights tonight. The forecast, I think it was like a 4 or 5 forecast, which is good. It's not spectacular. The one that we had May 10th and 11th was a 9, and that is basically the highest forecast you can get on the charts. This, if I remember correctly, was either a 4 or 5 that night, which is kind of like you might see them in Colorado, but it was a phenomenal night. And I kept telling him, I'm like, we are seeing the Northern Lights. I can see them in the sky. I can see the pink in the sky. He's like, no, I want to photograph the Milky Way. And about a month later, I sat down with him and we reviewed some of the photos that he captured that night. And he shows me this photo of the Northern Lights. And I was like, all right, so you did actually watch and see what was going on. So it was pretty cool. It's neat when you see them in a place that you don't normally see them, because it's just a special opportunity. This cloud here, this is golden or a yellow color because of the light pollution that we tend to see on the east side of the park from the Front Range lights. So that's why that's it's like a lenticular cloud. It was just this really cool looking cloud. This was up in northern Colorado, and it was one of those nights, like I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, that I was not anticipating photographing night skies. I was going to a campsite. We got a late start. It was about midnight when I stopped to get out and walk one of my dogs, and I looked up and the sky was just bouncing with color and bouncing with stars. I mean, there were just stars everywhere. And so I finished walking the dog and I went back, grabbed all my camera gear and set up. This was roadside photo, silhouette, because the road actually goes right through the middle of these trees here. That's why there is a kind of a V in here. But the way that the Milky Way was lining up, everything came together perfectly. So even though we do a lot of planning, know when the new moon is, know the time window that you have each night to see the core of the Milky Way, know what meteor showers are happening, know what kind of celestial activities are going on. Sometimes just be ready for it too. Those special moments can happen when you least expect it. This is a photo that I like to show. This is what's called Tahosa Valley. So this is along Highway 7, just south of Estes Park. Several either meteors. This one's probably a satellite there. Actually, they're probably all satellites now that I look closely at them. So this is obviously the core of the Milky Way. But this is one of those photos that I actually show as an example of light pollution. This is a really, really dark area. You can see how much detail the camera picked up on the Milky Way, how many stars it picked up, yet there's still some light pollution here, and it's just shooting straight up. We've got some blue light. These are probably LED lights. This is probably more incandescent lights over here. So it's a good example of how easily just covering those lights and preventing that light from spreading, and how much different that photo would be if those lights were just capped down a little bit. This is another photo from Rocky Mountain. So this is one of the Perseids meteors. This is looking north. This is one of those things that I try to tell people that sometimes in some places, especially with the popularity of astrophotography these days, that sometimes you're just going to get cars in the view. I was sitting there. This is these are actually 2 different exposures. So this foreground is a 25-second exposure. This, although I didn't put it in here, this is actually more probably a 15-second, maybe even like a 11-second exposure. So what I was trying to do is I wanted a long exposure on the meadow so that I could actually see some of the detail down in there. I didn't want to make it look like daytime. I didn't want it to look abnormal, but if my eyes adjust for night for the darkness at night, I can start to see details. I can start to see the meadow and the trees and the mountains and the snow in the mountains. I could not get a 4-minute window without cars coming through through this valley that's down there. And I figured, you know what, I'm just going to embrace it. And it's just going to be kind of part of what's happening. I do a lot of documentary work with my photography, and it just kind of, to me, it just kind of became a story about, you know, we have things going on in space above us. We have things going on the ground. We have things going on with people, and we just kind of we're all doing our thing each day, each night that we're out there. This is probably one of my favorite photographs from being out at night. I was photographing fireworks. This was July, I think it was July 5th, a couple of years ago, and I was photographing fireworks and came back. This was a dispersed campsite that I was staying at deep into the national forest. So by the time I got back to my campsite, it was probably close to about 11:30, quarter to 12. And same thing, I looked up and it was just this gorgeous, crystal clear sky. There was no smoke, wildfire smoke. There was no light pollution. It was just beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And I was staying next to this little lake, this little pond. And so I set my camera up and I'm out there and I'm kind of enjoying what I'm seeing, and I'm photographing. I'm really excited what I'm photographing. And all of a sudden behind me, I hear this scratching on the ground. And I turn around and my headlamp catches the eyes of a buck, a mule deer buck. And he was he was probably 4 or 5 feet behind me. He wasn't that far. And I never even heard him come up, you know, kind of like what Mike was saying earlier. You hear things differently at night, and you can also get really, you know, we get very focused on the photography that we're doing. And all of a sudden we realize that we're not paying attention. And at night, you probably need to pay attention even more. And thankfully, I just kind of turned around. I think he was kind of curious about what I was doing out there. I turned around, he kind of looked at me, and then he just sauntered off a little bit. But it was one of those, many times I actually have had animals kind of come up to me when I'm out in the dark. This is another Northern Lights photo. This was taken in southeastern Montana. I have really enjoyed in the last couple of years, as we've been reaching a higher peak of Northern Lights activity, I really have been enjoying photographing it in different locations. You know, I have been to Alaska to photograph it. I've seen it in Canada and photographed in Canada, but it's kind of cool to find it in these places where you don't normally see it. So last November, it was a 5 or a 6 forecast, which is really pretty good. We should have seen it in Colorado. But I had a vision of a place in Wyoming that I wanted to photograph it. And I got in my car and I drove up there, and I wasn't seeing it, and the clouds weren't working. You know, they weren't cooperating with what I was hoping for. So I went a little bit farther north. And the next spot that I went to, I realized that the mountains and the hills were too tall and I wasn't going to see the Northern Lights. They just weren't strong enough to rise above those hills that were around me. So I went a little bit farther north. Next thing I know, within a night, I had actually driven into southeastern Montana. When I finally saw these were about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I found this dirt road out in this open territory, and the sky was just, you know, it's called Big Sky Country for a reason in Montana. And actually saw some of these. So you can get it's easy to get addicted to some of this stuff, but I was happy that I saw it. I stayed out there for sunrise and got a couple of cool sunrise shots. This is a late season. This is back in Rocky Mountain National Park. This is a late season photograph. This is a blended photograph. You know, the core of the Milky Way, as you get into September, kind of dips. You don't see as much of the Milky Way, and you don't have as much time with the core of the Milky Way. But I did catch a meteor in it. Actually, this would have been August. This would have been a Perseids meteor, but this would have been a little bit later in August as that meteor shower is kind of declining in activity. But this is the Alpine Visitor Center up here, and this is a blended photograph. I was curious. I had never been up Old Fall River Road at night, and I wanted to see what I could photograph up there under the cover of darkness. And this is yet another one of those times where I stood out there photographing away, and I'm watching the sky, kind of like Mike says, you just enjoy, appreciate, take it all in. And all of a sudden I hear this chomping, this like tearing of grass. and tearing of plants. And I turn around, there's a cow elk kind of slowly making her way over to me. Kind of the same thing like the mule deer buck. She's just kind of curious about, what are you doing out here? And I know if there's one elk, there's usually more elk. So, and I never did see them. I didn't want to, you're not supposed to spotlight them or anything. So I didn't, I'm sure there were others out there. I didn't hear any nearby, but that time I did pay attention. That time I did keep my senses about me to kind of pay attention to what was going on. But this was so I did get a nice blended photograph that I was pretty happy with. This is another one in Rocky Mountain National Park. We talked earlier about how certain times of the year the Milky Way is vertical, horizontal. We've shown you a wide variety of photographs, where you can get the whole arch of the Milky Way. You can get it kind of diagonal. You can get it in these vertical positions. Like this previous one, I'm not seeing a lot of the core. A lot of that color, the colorful part has already dipped down a little bit, but here, this is dipping right into a lake, and there's just some nice color there. This is one of those spots where we do have, I know there is always wildlife around. I've seen fox, I've seen moose, I've seen black bear, I have seen elk, a lot of elk like this area. So what winds up happening, so there was one time I had a client out there, and we were, I was kind of watching the wildlife that was going on. He was really comfortable with nighttime settings. And as we are standing there photographing, and I think he was from Boston, if I remember correctly, as we were photographing, all of a sudden we hear water splashing. And I knew there had been a cow moose that had been hanging out in the area. And it turned out she was on the other side of the lake, and he just started, he's like, he wanted to pack his stuff up. I'm like, no, we're fine. I know she'll stay over there. But it was one of those nights that it was just everything kind of came together. You just have these cool experiences with other wildlife out at night, because wildlife, like we were talking earlier, they need the cover of night for protection. That keeps them safe from predators. They can do a little bit more foraging at night when maybe they feel a little bit safer. It's also much cooler. The bugs may not be as bad for them. So it's kind of fun to have those experiences. And I believe this is the last photo that I wanted to share. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, one of the things that, besides the fact that I just really love photographing the night skies, one of the reasons that I've really started getting more involved in advocacy for dark skies is that I do like, my passion is wildlife. I'm a wildlife photographer. I like telling the stories of wildlife. I like, writing about them. And if you look closely, this is actually a meadow of deer. So this is this was 428, I'm sorry, not deer, elk. This is 428 seconds. This is a really, really long exposure. You can see the car passing by over here. You can see some light coming off some of the houses at this ranch. And obviously it's a longer exposure. I have the star trails in here. This is one exposure. This is not a blended exposure. But I wanted to share that thought, that closing thought of, we're all experiencing the night sky. There's a lot going on out there. Our wildlife is definitely, needs the cover of darkness. So, I just wanted to show that to you, that there is, even, if we take that long exposure and see what's happening at night, you might discover that there's actually quite a bit going on. So real quickly, these are some of the things that I have coming up. I have quite a bit of quite a few workshops coming up this year, all kinds of different places. I am doing some night photography workshops with the Estes Park Memorial Observatory in August. That'll be during the Perseids. And then I have a lot of other different trips coming up over the course of the next 18 months or so. So Mike, you want to jump in?
Sorry, I forgot I was muted.
No,
So I have a workshop scheduled for the remainder of the summer. 4 dates in Westcliff, one of which is this coming Thursday. So I do have spots available for this Thursday if anybody's interested. And then July 5th, August 4th, August 31st. And then also I have 2 more workshops scheduled for the paint mines. One of them is this coming Sunday, June 9th. So I have spots available for that, and also spots available for August 1st. I am doing a mindfulness workshop at Fountain Creek Nature Center on July 13th. And then something that's not on this slide is I also am have a introduction to editing using Lightroom and Camera Raw scheduled for this coming Saturday. If anybody's interested in that, you can let me know, or you can visit my website and look at my schedule.
So both of us, both Mike and I, wanted to share that we have some different offers. So if you are ever, the ones that I have, if you're ever looking for cotton carrier, you can save 10% on that by using the code Dawn Wilson, or you can save 10% on Topaz software by using the code DWPhoto15, or try this, or use this link, and you can actually get, they'll send you a free product, they being Think Tank, and free shipping. And then Mike has some other offers.
Yeah, so for anybody who has joined us tonight, and we appreciate you sticking with us, 10% off any of my Westcliff workshops for the rest of this season. Use code SAVE10 on my website, threepeaksphoto.com. I mentioned earlier that I am a reseller for Explorer and Nisi. So if you're looking for a tripod or some filters, you can also save 10% with the code SAVE10 at my retail site at venturecamphoto.com. And then you can use my ambassador code, which is 3 Peaks discount at moveshootmove.com if you're interested in any of their trackers or accessories. That'll save you 5%. Okay, so I know that we've gone past our time, but I think I speak for Dawn. I'm willing to stick around if anybody has any burning questions. I'm willing to stick around and answer those for you. Oh, and this is one of my photos. This was a very long exposure. I think that was the night that I ended up covered in frost. Was a winter night out in Westcliff at the windmill. So I know, Dawn, you've been checking on the chat.
I have. I'm trying to see. Let's see. So there was one question, Mike, that you might want to provide some insight into. So Renata asks, with the OM1 Mark II for Milky Way, would you use a 12 millimeter f2 lens or a 12 to 40 millimeter 2.8 lens? My preference would be to have the zoom lens. I just like having a little bit of flexibility. And I think an f2 to an f2.8 isn't that much of a difference. Both of those would be really, really good apertures.
Yeah, I would agree. The thing with buying a prime lens of that focal length is that you're probably only going to end up using it for astro stuff. Whereas if you have the zoom lens, you have that flexibility. And the question is whether or not the lens is sharp, that 12 millimeter, if that lens is sharp, opened all the way up to 2.0. So I, like you, am not that familiar with the Olympus equipment, but perhaps you can join a user group and ask people who have experience with both of those lenses what their experiences have been, and then base your decision on what they have to say.
And David asks, can you explain how to calculate the NPF rule?
Yeah, so it's very easy. Buy photo pills and then go to the function that says spot stars. And then on that screen, you'll be able to enter your camera, make and model, and your focal length and your aperture, and it will calculate the shutter time for you. There is a formula for it, but it's a rather complicated formula. So this is one of those instances where I prefer to have something calculated for me. You know, when I'm doing things like calculating equivalent exposures, I like to rely on my brain in case my phone dies. But this is one of those things you'll never remember the formula, or some people might not even understand all of the things that are in the formula. So just get photo pills. It's well worth the $10 if you don't have it already. Spot stars, and then enter in your information, and you have the ability to choose the default setting or I forget what it's called, the accurate setting. So use the default setting, and that's going to give you a longer time, and it does work very well.
There were a couple of questions in the chat about using the camera's timer instead of the remote. From what I've done, that is certainly an option. I think the limitation there is that if you need an exposure longer than 30 seconds, your timer is not going to allow that longer. It's
Right.
going to max out at 30 seconds.
Two
I don't know
other
if you
things.
wanted to.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. I was going to say you have other points.
Two other things about using the timer. One is that most cameras have a light on the front that blinks when you activate your timer. So you may, if you're by yourself, it's not going to be a problem. But if you're shooting with other people, like the Canon's is red, Nikon's is amber, and that light is a lot brighter than you think it is. And that will ruin somebody's photo if you're photographing with someone else. The other thing is the noise. The beeping sound that the timer makes can really be annoying. And I had an experience like that just recently, and where the people didn't have remotes and were using the timer, and the beeping sound kind of got to me after a few hours.
Edward asked, where was that tracked panorama taken? Mike, foreground is amazing.
Oh,
I'm not sure which panorama it was.
I think the one with the fall colors. Thank you. That is a secret location that I would have to blindfold you to take you there.
Typical photographer.
No, it's just, there's lots of places I'm happy to share, but this one I don't want to see
Understand.
overrun with people. So
Understand.
yeah,
I have another question though, and
Sure.
you may have covered it. I had to step away for a minute. Did you guys talk about whether the slides might be available for us to review after the fact?
Well, we are recording, and I'm not sure if we can send that to people who registered for tonight. I don't know if Zoom captures contact information and allows us to do that. But I can certainly post it on my social media, and Dawn can probably do the same.
Yeah, we'll find a way to. I was thinking there might be a way to maybe put it on our website, with there are a couple different ways that we could do that.
Yeah, a lot of good information. This was excellent. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank
good.
you.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. So there was one, I think there was just there were two other questions I think I wanted to talk about. One was, do you recommend removing UV and polarizing filters? And I know both Mike and I responded to that, but just so that everybody knows that you do always want to take any filters off. Any extra layer of glass on your lens will cut down how much light is getting into the camera. And that's the whole challenge at night, right? Other than avoiding the bears and the moose and the deer that are out there, the whole idea is that you're trying to get as much light into the camera as possible. So you have to remove that layer of glass, just for even that little extra bit can help.
Right. And another thing about filters is if you're in the dark and you have a bright light source somewhere, that extra piece of glass can cause a lens flare. So anytime you have an extra piece of glass on front of your lens, you run the risk of introducing some lens flares if there's some bright light sources in your area, like a like a lamp post off in the distance, or a light on somebody's house. So that's another reason why I have gotten away from using filters. So I know that a lot of people use UV filters, and Nice even has a filter that's just plain glass for protection. A lot of people use those. If you're uncomfortable taking that off at night, then I'm not going to force you to do that. I've seen things happen where equipment has met the ground because you couldn't see where you're walking. So yeah, but usually it's a good idea to take the filters off.
And then the one other one was, do you turn off IBIS in the camera body or just the VR or optical image stabilization on the lens? So the IBIS is the in-body image stabilization. And I would say yes, I would turn off any vibration reduction, whether it's lens or body, because you just don't want anything potentially moving on that camera. And as Mike described earlier, that's the whole thing, that it's kind of counteracting. It's believing that you're hand holding it if it's on. So it's counteracting that by kind of balancing it out. Would you agree, Mike?
Right. Yeah, I would turn everything off. My cameras don't have in-body stabilization, so I don't have to worry about that. But anything that has the potential of moving your camera is possibly going to cause a problem. That I know for a fact that the function on the lens will. I have in my regular class presentation, I have a photograph that shows what the stars look like when your image stabilization is on, and it's not good. There was another question about that just came in about where to find the timing, the dates. Oops. I lost my chat. Oh, there it is. So regarding the dates for shooting the Milky Way, where can I find a list shooting from New Mexico? So all that information I got was from PhotoPills. So the new moon dates are going to be the same for Colorado and New Mexico. So what I do is normally just find what's the name of that calendar online, moon and sun calendar or whatever it is. Or you can even turn on the moon cycle on Google Calendar if you use Google Calendar. And so I look for those dates first, and then I go into PhotoPills into the planning function, and then you can enter any date that you want, pick it from their calendar, and it gives you all the information. And so if you have PhotoPills synced to your location, then it's going to give you the correct times and things. I have noticed, and this was interesting, I noticed last year that my times for sunset and sunrise and things like that on Google Calendar are like 30 minutes off, and I don't know why. So I now do not use Google Calendar when I'm looking to figure out when the sun is going to set or the sun is going to rise. So I rely on PhotoPills for all the information.
And I do rely on Sun Surveyor and PhotoPills, but I'll use Sun Surveyor. It kind of lists everything out. You can actually search by a GPS coordinate. You can search by a name. You can search by, like my location. And it'll bring up not only the sunrise and sunset dates, it'll give you the windows of time for the Milky Way. It provides a lot of information.
Yeah, and I've never used that app, but PhotoPills has a ton of stuff in it too. And they have good videos on their website. I had to watch a video on their website to figure out how to find a date and look up the Milky Way times. All right, anything else? Anybody else have any questions?
I'm not seeing anything else in the chat.
Okay.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Bob.
Hey, for people looking for Milky Way calendars, there's a website called Capture the Atlas. And he has free Milky Way calendars by latitude as PDFs. If you could download all of them you want. I usually print them out, so I have them with me. And they have sunrise, sunset, moonrise, moonset, Milky Way rise and set, how long it's visible, and it's a PDF, and you can get them for free. And I get them every year, so and I get them for different. You know, when I'm up here, when I'm down in Phoenix, or when I'm traveling someplace, I'll get those, and I found them to be pretty accurate. So that's an option too, in case you don't have.
What's
photo
the
pill.
website again?
It's called CaptureTheAtlas.com.
Okay.
The guy does a lot of Milky Way stuff all around the world. It's pretty cool stuff, but that calendar I found is pretty useful.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the tip.
Sure. Great show. Great presentation too. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
You're very welcome.
It was really great. Appreciate all the information.
Oh, you're welcome. All right. Anybody have anything else?
Thanks everybody for sticking around.
Yeah. So these are the true night owls. You were talking earlier about hoping we weren't too late for people who live in different parts of the country. But if you're a night photographer, then you're a night owl. So I'm definitely a night owl. I'll be up for. I have some work to do, so I'll be up till at least 2.
Well, very good. And we'll figure out a way to, like we said, we are definitely recording this, so we'll figure out a way that we can share this.
Yeah, which I should stop the recording now.